Hey guys, today, I want you to travel back with me exactly 100 years into the past. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine it is the year 1925 in America. There are no smartphones in your pocket. There is no internet, no social media, not even television in your living room. If you want to talk to someone, you either write them a letter, wait for the postman to deliver it in a few days, or, if you are lucky, use a black rotary telephone that only a few households could afford. If you want news, you don't scroll through a feed. You walk down the street and buy a newspaper from a paperboy shouting the headlines at the corner. If you want entertainment, you don't turn on Netflix. Instead, you may go to a silent movie theater or listen to live jazz music pouring out from a bar. 100 years ago, life in America was slower, harder in many ways, but also full of transformation. It was a time of invention, culture, and struggle. The people of that era built the foundation of the America we know today. So, for the next hour, let us take a journey together and explore what life looked like in America exactly 1 century ago. Let us begin with the most basic thing: home life. Most American families lived in small houses, often wooden, with only a few rooms. Many rural houses did not even have electricity. Imagine waking up in the morning and lighting a kerosene lamp just to see your way around the kitchen. Water had to be pumped from a well, and bathrooms were often outside the house in the form of an outhouse. Cooking was very different. There were no microwaves or fast food chains. Every meal had to be prepared from scratch. Bread was baked at home. Milk was delivered by a milkman with a horse-drawn cart, and meat was purchased fresh from the local butcher. Refrigerators were not common yet. Instead, people used ice boxes, wooden chests, where a large block of ice kept food cool. When it came to clothing, men rarely went outside without a hat. Suits and ties were common, even for ordinary men. Women's fashion was changing rapidly. The 1920s were the age of the flapper. Young women who wore shorter dresses, bobbed their hair, and enjoyed jazz clubs. This was shocking to the older generation, but it symbolized freedom and change. And what about transportation? In 1925, the famous Ford Model T car was becoming affordable for middle-class families, but cars were still new. Many Americans continued to use horse-drawn wagons, especially in the countryside. Cities had electric streetcars, and long-distance travel was done mostly by train. In short, life was simple compared to today, but it was also more physical and more community-based. Families spent evenings together because there was no television to pull them apart. Now let us talk about something very important: work and jobs, the way people earned their living 100 years ago. In the 1920s, America was transforming from a farming nation into an industrial nation. But still, a very large part of the population lived in the countryside and worked on farms. Imagine waking up before sunrise, putting on your boots, and spending the entire day working with your hands, plowing fields, milking cows, feeding animals, or harvesting crops. There were no modern tractors or automatic machines. A farmer relied on horses, simple tools, and his own strength. In cities, life was different. The Industrial Revolution had already changed America. Factories were everywhere. Steel factories, textile factories, coal mines, and automobile plants. Work in these places was not easy. The hours were long, sometimes 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. There were very few labor laws, so conditions were often unsafe. If a worker got injured, there was no insurance to protect him. Wages were low compared to today, but people worked hard because they had no choice. A family's survival depended on every member contributing. Even children sometimes worked, selling newspapers on the street or helping in family businesses. At the same time, new industries were rising. The Ford Motor Company in Detroit was producing cars at a pace never seen before. thanks to the assembly line. This changed the idea of factory work. Instead of one person building a car from start to finish, each worker would specialize in one small task, repeated all day. This made cars cheaper, but made jobs repetitive and boring. For women, the 1920s opened new opportunities. Before this time, women mostly worked as housewives, teachers, or nurses. But after World War I, many women entered offices as secretaries, telephone operators, and sales clerks. It was also the era when women had just gained the right to vote in 1920, so their role in society was growing. Still, if we compare work life in 1925 with today, it was much tougher. No air-conditioned offices, no computers, no work from home. Work was physical, demanding, and often dangerous, but it built the foundation of modern America's economy. Now imagine for a moment that you are living in America in 1925. You want to talk to a friend who lives in another city. How will you do it? There are no WhatsApp messages, no emails, no video calls. The fastest way to send a message is the telegraph, a system that sends short-coded signals through wires. People would go to a telegraph office, write a short message, often just a few words, and pay for each word. The message would be transmitted, and the receiver would get it written on paper. For ordinary families, the most common way of communication was still the letter. People would sit down at a desk, take out pen and paper, and carefully write their thoughts. The letter might take days, sometimes weeks, to reach the other person. Can you imagine the patience? Today we get angry if someone doesn't reply within a few minutes. The telephone was beginning to spread. By the mid-1920s, about 15 million telephones were in use across America. But remember, America's population was over 100 million at that time, so only a small portion of people had access to it. And even those phones were not private. Many homes used party lines where several households shared the same connection. If you picked up the phone, you might hear your neighbor's conversation. Now let's move to entertainment, which was undergoing a revolution. The radio was the king of entertainment in the 1920s. Families would gather around a large wooden radio set in the living room to listen to music, news, sports broadcasts, and comedy shows. It was magical, voices and songs traveling invisibly through the air into people's homes. For the first time, America was connected through live broadcasts. Movies were another huge form of entertainment. This was the era of silent films. Imagine going to a theater and watching Charlie Chaplin making people laugh without saying a single word. Audiences loved it. In 1927, something historic happened: the Jazz Singer was released, the first movie with synchronized sound. This gave birth to the era of talkies, and Hollywood exploded with creativity. Music was changing too. The 1920s are often called the Jazz Age. Jazz music, born from African American communities, spread across the nation. Dance halls and nightclubs were full of people moving to the lively rhythms of Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. Jazz was not just music. It was energy, rebellion, and joy. Books and newspapers were everywhere. There was no television, so reading was the main way to learn about the world. Big newspapers in New York, Chicago, and other cities shaped people's opinions. Magazines like Time were first published in the 1920s. And let's not forget sports. Baseball was America's favorite pastime. Babe Ruth became a national hero, filling stadiums with cheering crowds. Boxing, too, was hugely popular, with champions like Jack Dempsey drawing massive audiences. So, communication and entertainment in the 1920s were slower compared to today. But they were also magical, new, and exciting. People experienced things for the first time that we now take for granted. 100 years ago, America was not only changing in culture and lifestyle, but also in technology. The 1920s were a decade of innovation. Many inventions that we consider ordinary today were brand new back then. Let's start with the automobile. The Ford Motor Company had introduced the Model T in 1908, but by the 1920s, cars were becoming affordable for the middle class. Thanks to Henry Ford's assembly line production, a car that once took more than 12 hours to build could now be completed in less than 2 hours. This reduced the cost, and suddenly millions of Americans could own a car. The car completely changed daily life. Families could travel farther, live outside crowded cities, and take vacations. Roads, highways, and gas stations began to spread across the country. Imagine the excitement of families driving for the first time, feeling the freedom of the open road. Now, let's talk about aviation. The Wright brothers had flown the first airplane in 1903, but in the 1920s, aviation became more advanced. Airplanes were still small and risky, but they captured the imagination of the public. People dreamed of a future where humans could travel across the world in the sky. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh became the first person to fly nonstop across the Atlantic Ocean from New York to Paris. That single event made aviation a national obsession. Electricity was also spreading quickly. In 1900, only about 10% of American homes had electricity. By the mid-1920s, more than half of urban households were connected to power lines. This meant electric lights, refrigerators, washing machines, and radios were slowly entering homes. However, rural America was still behind. Millions of farmers did not get electricity until the 1930s. The telephone was another life-changing invention. As I mentioned earlier, about 15 million homes had telephones by the mid-1920s. It may not sound like much today, but at that time, it was revolutionary. People could hear each other's voices from miles away, something magical for families separated by distance. Other inventions also shaped the decade. The 1920s saw the first commercial refrigerators, the first electric shavers, and even the development of traffic lights in cities. Everyday convenience was slowly improving. Medicine was also advancing, though not as fast. In 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, the world's first antibiotic, though it was not widely used until the 1940s. But even before that, hospitals were beginning to use better medical equipment, X-rays, and sterilization techniques. In short, technology in the 1920s was on the edge of a revolution. It was not as fast as today's digital transformation, but for people of that era, these inventions were breathtaking. Just like we are amazed by smartphones and artificial intelligence, they were amazed by cars, airplanes, radios, and electric lights. If there is one word to describe the 1920s in America, it is change. Social life and culture were transforming in ways that shocked the older generation, but excited the younger one. The 1920s are often called the Roaring Twenties, a decade of energy, music, fashion, and freedom. After the destruction of World War I, people wanted to live, celebrate, and enjoy life. Let's begin with the most famous event in American society during this time: Prohibition. In 1920, the U.S. government passed a law banning the sale and consumption of alcohol. The idea was to reduce crime and improve health, but the result was the opposite. Instead of eliminating alcohol, Prohibition created a massive underground market. People went to hidden bars called speakeasies, where alcohol was secretly served. These places were often controlled by gangsters like Al Capone, who became rich through illegal liquor. Prohibition also gave rise to jazz clubs, dancing, and late-night parties. So ironically, the law meant to control society actually made nightlife more exciting. Next, let's talk about women in the 1920s. This decade was a turning point for women's rights. In 1920, Women gained the right to vote through the 19th Amendment. This gave them political power and confidence. At the same time, a new type of woman appeared in American culture, the flapper. Flappers wore shorter skirts, cut their hair into bobs, wore makeup, smoked cigarettes, and danced to jazz. They rejected the traditional idea that women should only be quiet, polite, and stay at home. Instead, they wanted freedom, fun, and equality. For the older generation, this was shocking. For the younger generation, it was exciting. The 1920s were also the time of the Harlem Renaissance, a cultural movement. Led by African-American writers, musicians, and artists in New York City's Harlem neighborhood. Figures like Langston Hughes in poetry and Duke Ellington in music gave voice to Black pride, creativity, and struggle. Jazz, which started in African-American communities, spread to the whole nation and became the sound of the decade. Dance was another cultural revolution. The Charleston, the Lindy Hop, and swing dances filled ballrooms. Imagine huge halls with hundreds of people dancing together, the music loud, the energy electric. Fashion also changed. Men wore tailored suits but with a more relaxed style than in earlier decades. Women's clothing became lighter, more comfortable, and expressive. The image of the confident young woman in a fringe dress dancing to jazz became the symbol of the Roaring Twenties. Sports, too, became part of culture. Athletes like Babe Ruth in baseball and Jack Dempsey in boxing became national icons. Crowds filled stadiums. And sports stars became celebrities for the first time. At the same time, not everyone was celebrating. Rural and conservative communities often rejected these cultural shifts. They held on to traditional values, church life, and simple living. This created a divide between urban modern America and rural traditional America. In short, the 1920s were a decade of cultural explosion, music, dance, fashion, and freedom on one side, and resistance, tradition, and tension on the other. It was a clash that shaped the future of American society. Now let us turn to the life of children and students in America 100 years ago. Childhood in the 1920s looked very different from what we see today. First, let us talk about schools. In many rural areas, children studied in one-room schoolhouses. Imagine a small wooden building with a single teacher, where all students, from the youngest to the oldest, sat together. The teacher would move from one group to another, teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. There were no projectors, no computers, no smart boards. The main tools were chalk, a blackboard, and a few well-used textbooks. In cities, schools were larger and more advanced, but even there, the style of teaching was strict. Students sat in neat rows, memorized lessons, and recited them aloud. Discipline was very important, and sometimes punishment was physical, something unacceptable today. Education was expanding during this time. In 1920, about 30% of young people finished high school, a huge increase compared to earlier decades. More families realized the value of education, especially as America became more industrial. For children, life was not only about school. Playtime was also a big part of childhood, but it looked different from today. There were no video games, no tablets, no cartoons on TV. Instead, children played outside, marbles, and baseball in empty fields. Boys often built slingshots or played with toy soldiers, while girls played with dolls or helped at home. Many children in rural areas had responsibilities at an early age. They helped their parents with farming, feeding animals, carrying water, or harvesting crops. For some, childhood ended quickly because by the age of 13 or 14, they were expected to work full-time. Entertainment for children was simple. Families might go together to watch a silent film. Storybooks and comic strips in newspapers provided imagination and laughter. By the late 1920s, characters like Mickey Mouse were just beginning to appear, giving children new heroes to enjoy. At the same time, life was not easy. Many children faced poverty. Some had to leave school early to work and support their families. Child labor laws were being introduced, but not everywhere. In big cities, it was common to see young boys selling newspapers on the streets, shouting headlines for a few cents. In short, childhood in the 1920s was simpler, tougher, and more connected to family and community. There was less technology, but perhaps more direct experience with nature, responsibility, and real life. When we think about life 100 years ago, one of the most striking differences is in health and medicine. Today, we can go to a hospital with advanced machines, antibiotics, and trained doctors. But in the 1920s, medical care looked very different. Let's start with diseases. In the 1920s, many illnesses that we can cure easily today were still deadly. Tuberculosis, diphtheria, smallpox, and polio were common threats. A child could become disabled or even die from diseases that modern vaccines now prevent. Families often lived in fear of epidemics sweeping through communities. The biggest medical discovery of that decade came in 1928, when Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, the world's first antibiotic. However, it was not widely used until the 1940s. So in the 1920s, if someone got a serious infection, there was often little doctors could do. Hospitals existed, but they were not as advanced as today. Many did not have enough equipment, and rural communities often had no hospital at all. In small towns, people relied on family doctors who would visit patients at home. Imagine a doctor carrying a black leather bag with a stethoscope, some medicines, and basic instruments, traveling from house to house. Surgery was also riskier. Anesthesia was available, but antibiotics were not, which meant infections. After surgery were a major danger, even childbirth was risky. Many women still gave birth at home with the help of midwives, and maternal death rates were far higher than today. Public health campaigns were slowly improving life. Cities began building better sewage systems, promoting hygiene, and encouraging vaccinations. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918-1920, which killed millions worldwide, had taught America the importance of health measures. At the same time, mental health was poorly understood. There was little awareness or treatment for conditions like depression or anxiety. People often suffered in silence, or worse, were placed in asylums without proper care. Yet, there were signs of progress. X-ray machines were being used in hospitals, insulin was discovered in 1921 and began saving the lives of diabetics, and vitamins were becoming recognized as essential to good health. So, if we compare then and now, the difference is huge. A simple infection that is cured by one pill today could kill someone 100 years ago. But the 1920s were the beginning of modern medicine, a period when discovered American cities versus countryside in the 1920s. To truly understand America 100 years ago, we must look at the difference between life in the cities and life in the countryside. The 1920s was a decade of contrast, a fast-moving urban world versus a slower traditional rural one. Let's begin with the cities. Places like New York, Chicago, and Detroit were booming. Skyscrapers were rising for the first time. The famous Chrysler Building and Empire State Building were under construction by the end of the decade. Neon lights lit up city streets and cars filled the roads. Cities were full of noise, energy, and opportunity. Urban life meant access to electricity, telephones, running water, and better schools. People went to movie theaters, jazz clubs, and sports stadiums. Immigrants from Europe arrived in huge numbers, filling neighborhoods with Italian, Irish, Jewish, and other cultural communities. Cities were centers of modern America where fashion, technology, and entertainment spread. But while the cities were growing, the countryside told a very different story. Rural America was still dominated by farming. Millions of families lived in small towns or on farms, often without electricity or indoor plumbing. Daily life was centered around hard work, plowing fields, tending animals, and surviving on what the land provided. While city people wore modern clothes and listened to jazz, rural communities held on to traditional values. Religion, family, and community gatherings shaped their culture. For many farmers, the 1920s were not prosperous. Agricultural prices fell after World War I, and farmers struggled with debt. While city people celebrated wealth and entertainment, farmers faced hardship and uncertainty. This divide between urban modernism and rural traditionalism was not just about lifestyle, it created tension. City people saw rural communities as old-fashioned, while rural people saw city life as immoral and corrupt. This cultural clash appeared in debates about prohibition, women's rights, and even in the famous Scopes trial of 1925, where a teacher was put on trial for teaching evolution in a Tennessee school. The trial became a symbol of science versus religion, modern values versus traditional ones. So, America in the 1920s was really two Americas. One was fast, bright, and modern, the world of skyscrapers, radios, and jazz. The other was slow, simple, and traditional, the world of farms, churches, and small towns. Together, they formed a nation in transition, a nation balancing the old with the new. When we think about America 100 years ago, we cannot ignore the politics and major events that shaped the decade. The 1920s was called the Republican era because three Republican presidents, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, led the country during this time. After World War I ended in 1918, Americans were tired of war and international problems. President Harding promised a return to normalcy, meaning a return to peace, stability, and traditional values. People wanted comfort after the sacrifices of the war, but Harding's presidency was also marked by corruption scandals. The most famous was the Teapot Dome scandal, where government officials secretly accepted bribes from oil companies. This damaged public trust, and when Harding died suddenly in 1923, his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, became president. Coolidge was quiet and serious, earning the nickname Silent Cal. He believed the government should interfere as little as possible in people's lives. His famous phrase was, "The business of America is business." This captured the spirit of the 1920s, when economic growth and business expansion dominated. The U.S. economy boomed. New industries like automobiles, aviation, radios, and consumer goods flourished. People could buy products on credit for the first time, and advertising encouraged them to spend. Wall Street became a symbol of wealth and success. But alongside prosperity, there were serious tensions. The 1920s also saw the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, a racist group that targeted African Americans, immigrants, Catholics, and Jews. At its peak, the Klan had millions of members and significant political power, especially in the South and Midwest. Immigration was another hot issue. In 1924, the U.S. passed the Immigration Act, which placed strict limits on how many people could come from Europe, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe. This reflected a growing fear of foreigners, communists, and anarchists after the Red Scare, a period when Americans feared the spread of communism following the Russian Revolution. Another major event was Prohibition, which had started in 1920. The government banned the sale of alcohol, hoping to reduce crime and improve society. But instead, Prohibition created a new problem: organized crime. Gangsters like Al Capone in Chicago made millions smuggling alcohol, and illegal bars called speakeasies became popular across the country. Toward the end of the decade, Herbert Hoover became president in 1929. He promised continued prosperity, but just months after he took office, the stock market crash of October 1929 shook the nation. This event ended the Roaring Twenties and began the Great Depression. So, politically, the 1920s was a time of prosperity, corruption, tension, and dramatic change. The government tried to stay small, business grew powerful, and society wrestled with issues of race, immigration, and morality. These events shaped the nation for decades to come. The 1920s in America were not only about politics and business, they were also about fun, excitement, and entertainment. This was the decade when sports stars and movie icons became national heroes. Let's start with sports. Baseball was the most popular sport in the country, and its biggest star was Babe Ruth, who played for the New York Yankees. He wasn't just a baseball player, he was a legend. His home runs drew massive crowds to stadiums, and he gave hope to millions of Americans during a time of change. Boxing was another sport that captured attention. Jack Dempsey, known as the Manasseh Mauler, was a heavyweight champion whose fights drew record-breaking audiences, both in stadiums and through the new technology of radio broadcasts. For the first time, people could listen to live sports at home, and it made athletes larger than life. College football also became extremely popular, with stars like Red Grange, known as the Galloping Ghost. Stadiums filled with tens of thousands of cheering fans, and universities began to see sports as a major part of their culture. Now let's move to entertainment. The 1920s was the golden age of Hollywood. Silent movies were at their peak, and actors like Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Clara Bow became worldwide celebrities. Clara Bow was called the It Girl because she represented the new, modern woman of the 1920s, free, fashionable, and bold. In 1927, cinema changed forever with the release of The Jazz Singer, the first talkie movie with sound. Audiences were amazed, and silent films quickly began to disappear. The movie industry exploded, and going to the theater became a favorite pastime for millions of Americans. Music also transformed American culture. This was the era of jazz, which was born in African American communities and spread nationwide. Cities like New Orleans, Chicago, and New York became jazz centers. Musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington made jazz a global phenomenon. Jazz clubs became symbols of freedom and creativity, especially during Prohibition, when people gathered in speakeasies to drink, dance, and listen to music. Radio was another entertainment revolution. By the mid-1920s, millions of households owned radios, and families would gather around to listen to music, news, sports, and comedy shows. For the first time, people across the country could share the same cultural experiences at the same time. Finally, we must mention dance crazes. The Charleston and the Lindy Hop became hugely popular dances, especially among young people. Dance halls were full of energy, symbolizing the spirit of the Roaring Twenties. In short, the 1920s made sports stars, movie actors, and jazz musicians into household names. Entertainment was no longer just a luxury. It became a central part of American life. The 1920s was not only about culture and entertainment. It was also a decade of amazing scientific and technological progress. Many of the things we take for granted today first appeared or became popular 100 years ago. Let's begin with transportation. The automobile completely changed American life. Before the 1920s, cars were a luxury for the rich, but thanks to Henry Ford and his Model T, cars became affordable for ordinary families. Ford used the assembly line system, which allowed cars to be mass-produced. Quickly and cheaply. By the mid-1920s, millions of Americans owned cars, and this created new industries, gas stations, motels, roadside diners, and highways. Families could now travel farther, and cities began to expand into suburbs. Air travel also took off in the 1920s. The most famous aviation event was in 1927, when Charles Lindbergh flew solo across the Atlantic Ocean in his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. This achievement made him an international hero and proved that long-distance air travel was possible. Airlines soon began carrying passengers, and people started dreaming of a future where the world was connected by air. Now, let's talk about electricity. In 1920, many rural homes still had no power, but by the end of the decade, electricity had spread to most cities and towns. With electricity came refrigerators, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and radios. These inventions made household work easier and gave families more time for leisure. For phase, inventions made household work easier and gave families more time for leisure. Women especially. Electric appliances began to change daily life.